Welcome back, everyone. I'm chatting with Roger Obando. And now I want to get back to something we started talking about, which is tech in a new industry. In particular, Roger was a co-founder and CTO at Baker Technologies in the cannabis tech industry. And I'd love to learn a little bit more, Roger, from you about how you got to that industry, how the idea came out, and then learn a little bit more about building tech in a completely new industry.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. It was a wild ride. It was from 2014 until end of 2018, early 2019 when we exited that. The way it started was I had actually been working on my previous startup called Camino. And I was in New York City at the time. And this was 2014, right when Washington and Colorado passed their legalization efforts, making them the first states to have adult use cannabis legalization. And I've always been a big proponent of legalization. I've always thought that cannabis prohibition is, I don't know, I mean, do your own research, but it was done for all the wrong reasons. And so I was sitting in New York and I'm seeing these articles that are popping up everywhere, right? Because all of a sudden, this is a new hot thing. It's coming up online all the time. And they're showing these images of dispensaries. There was only a handful at the time, right? It just started. So there's these dispensaries with people lined up around the block. It's not a new problem, right? Like this is not a new problem. This is retail. Eventually, this is all going. Even back then, we knew that this was just going the CPG route eventually. Yep. But right now is a huge opportunity because of the fact that the cannabis industry, unlike any other retail industry, abides by Pareto's principle, which indicates that 80% of the revenue is coming from 20% of the clientele, right? And so we're looking at these lines of people. And we're saying, all right, 2 out of every 10 of these people is sitting in line with $300, $400 in their pocket. They know exactly what they want. They don't want to talk to a bud tender and ask questions. The rest of these people are likely they're tourists. They're going to go inside. They're going to ask a bud tender to show them 14 jars of bud, and they're going to spend $20 on a couple of drinks and leave. And so the problem that we wanted to solve was, how do we get those 2 out of 10 to have a better experience? Because that will improve their experience, which will be good for the industry in general and for those high value customers. And then it'll be better for the retailers because they're not wasting as much time with the lower valued customers. And so we decided, hey, like this has got Grubhub written all over it. Like, why can't we just build an online menu system that allows these dispensaries to put their products online? We didn't do e-commerce just because of the fact that it's still, from a regulatory point of view, you wouldn't have to be a very good lawyer to make the case that someone ordering from Nevada and Colorado was making an interstate drug purchase. And we're like, all right, don't want to do any of that.
Touch that. Yep.
Don't want to touch it. Don't want to have any credit cards on record, none of that. And so we just did product reservation and got our foot in the door in the first few dispensaries in Colorado. And it was very successful in that these high value customers, a lot of young folks who are very used to using their smartphone for ordering stuff online, were like, oh yeah, sweet, I'll place my order. It'll be bagged up for me. I'll get a text message when it's ready and I'll go pick it up. And so we got, that's when we got our foot in the door. And then we started to, as I would recommend for anyone who's doing an early stage startup, listen to your customers. Be like, okay, well, what other problems are you seeing? And we saw problems with customer retention because as new dispensaries would open, the only way they could really acquire customers was to do these huge sales, first time shopper sale, 35% off your order. So you couldn't keep anyone loyal. So we built a loyalty program. And then we realized that the biggest problem that they had was actually marketing, and that none of the traditional, and this actually comes back to your initial question, right? What are the challenges of working in a new industry? People don't stop to think about the fact that, hey, maybe Salesforce doesn't want to work with the cannabis industry. They obviously wanted the opportunity to get the revenue that would come from the industry, but they were too worried about their pre-existing relationships with their banks, with their bigger customers. What if they were morally opposed to it? Like, would that cost them business? And so they weren't diving into it, which really opened the door for the first wave of Canatech companies. And we were the first ones. And we filled that gap. We did the targeted marketing solution, which really was the big win for us because we had millions of customer records on hand. And because of the fact that it's such a new industry, you didn't have the pre-existing kind of norms, right? I think in most retailers will start with email and they'll be like, they want to start email marketing. We tried that. No one's reading emails. Yep. We started doing text messaging and I was like, oh, that really hit. Now I think it's much more the norm that people are doing text marketing. But the cannabis industry was one of the first industries to really own that and say, this is how we're going to own our relationship with our customer. And so, that opportunity to leapfrog from a technology point of view was incredibly liberating from a technology perspective. You didn't have to do things the way they've always been done. You could, write the playbook as you were doing it. So that was a lot of fun. But also, you didn't get the support of a lot of the pre-existing technology either. It was the Wild West in the early days.
That's really interesting because if I contrast that actually with the Zebra and InsurTech, which is insurance is a long time established industry, tons of money spent in terms of brand building, marketing, advertising, and so while we didn't have to create a new space, right? The consumers were actively going online, searching, comparing in other industries. We did have to shift perspectives of the insurance carriers and change how they acquire their consumers, right? And change their perspective. And so that was what we thought. So while we didn't have to kind of create a new niche, right? And figure that out, which both has, to your sense, what you said, both the pros of being able to leapfrog and not like kind of use established norms, but also the cons of not being able to use established technologies to piggyback upon. We could use some of these, but we also we had to kind of fight this this chicken and the egg early on of carriers saying, okay, we might be interested, but we want to see you get traction first.
Yep.
Right. We don't want to go in yet, but then in order for us to get traction, right, we needed to get the carriers. So where we got is once we finally built enough and got enough momentum, right, then all of a sudden, to some extent, like the floodgates opened because we were able to show value and continue to provide value to both sides. And so, I guess what was that next step for you? Like, did you find a similar thing, or did you start to then hit hurdles because as you showed what was possible, some of the bigger players decided, oh, maybe I do want to play in this space?
Yeah. So one of the things that I always mention about the early days of Baker that made it very difficult was that we were catering to an audience that had a real severe lack of technical sophistication, right? I mean, you think about it, in the early days of legalization, the people who came into the legal market were the people who were doing it illicitly for decades. And imagine trying to come in and sell a CRM system to someone who has been maniacal about not keeping any records for the last 2 decades. Exactly. And you're trying to be like, oh no, but you want to have your customer phone numbers and you want them to be able to reach out to you. And so just even selling into that early mindset was so difficult. But as competition started to ramp up, and it was really about well, how do I now stay relevant? How do I compete? And we're just like, well, we've got some tools that can help you. Let us prove it to you. Let us show you what the ROI is on this. That made it a little easier. But in the early days, and I would imagine dealing with insurance companies to a lesser extent, but still, you're dealing with a bit of an antiquated mindset about what works and what doesn't work. A real turning point came probably 2016, 2017, as people started to realize that legalization was around for a couple of years and the sky hadn't fallen. They're like, okay, well, maybe this is around to stay. Maybe this is going to be a thing moving forward. And so you started to see professionals from other industries start to get interested in joining in the cannabis industry. And so they come in and they go, okay, great. What CRM are you using? And the companies are like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so they all were hit with this wall, like, oh my God, how have you made it this far with any of this stuff? And so bringing that talent in created this almost forced modernization of like, okay, I'm bringing in this expertise from elsewhere. Who's doing this? And then unfortunately, those folks were also really frustrated and disappointed in what the options were in the early days, because they're used to working with much more mature, well-funded, long-running pieces of software. And we're like, hey, everything in this industry is one of two things. It's either top down from something that was repurposed from another industry, so it kind of doesn't really work for this industry, or it's bottom up and it's only 18 months old. So it's still very, very green. It's got a lot of issues. We're still evolving it. And so they didn't get to have a plug and play one-stop shop solution. And it's still a situation in the cannabis industry where there's a lot of gaps of systems like that need to be built.